I'd love to know where you're watching from. Your comments always remind me how far these stories are able to travel. It means so much to have you here, sharing these tales across distances and time. If you're enjoying the journey, kindly subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. London, 1879, moved beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, its winter light stretching thin across the city as if reluctant to illuminate anything touched by sorrow. The capital breathed in a hush, still steeped in the etiquette of mourning that Queen Victoria herself had modeled for nearly 2 decades. In such an age, where grief had become a kind of national discipline, it was perhaps unsurprising that the morning of Eleanor Ashcombe's wedding felt more like a page from a somber chronicle than the start of a life newly blossomed. Yet she stepped from the carriage with a measured calm, her gloved hands steady, her spine unbending despite the undercurrent of dread coiling at the base of her ribcage. She had been raised to uphold duty with elegance, to speak softly when uncertain, and to never permit the world the satisfaction of witnessing her trepidation. Still, no schooling could fully brace a woman for a marriage arranged not by affection but by the machinery of aristocratic necessity. Eleanor stood at the entrance of St. George's, Hanover Square, her breath catching slightly as she gazed upon the cavernous shadows within. Candles flickered along the nave, glinting off polished brass and lending the air a fragile warmth that did not reach her skin. The scent of lilies, chosen in deference to the groom's late wife, clung to the air with an almost suffocating sweetness. Guests shifted in anticipation, their murmurs weaving through the aisles like wind through reeds. Ladies in jewel-toned silks exchanged theories about the new Duchess, while gentlemen inspected their gloves with feigned indifference. Eleanor felt their speculation as surely as if each whisper had been spoken into her ear. The Duke of Rudom waited at the altar, a still figure carved from self-denial. His broad shoulders were set with military precision, and though only in his mid-30s, grief had carved faint hollows beneath his eyes. He had once been admired for a reserved gentility that seemed to deepen into something sharper, more brittle, after the death of his Duchess. His hair, dark and neatly combed, reflected the candlelight with a muted sheen, while his expression bore the careful neutrality of a man who had grown accustomed to quiet suffering. The congregation watched him, waiting for some sign of warmth, but his posture remained unyielding, as if affection itself had become dangerous. Eleanor approached him with even steps, careful not to let her gaze linger too long on his profile. She had seen him only thrice before this day, once during a polite introductory visit, once at a formal dinner where he had spoken little, and once when the marriage contract was signed. His hand steady though his eyes had drifted occasionally to some distant memory. She had not expected grand passion. Such fantasies belonged more to novels than to contracts, but she had hoped, quietly, for at least the chance of mutual respect. Now, standing beside him beneath the vaulted roof, she sensed a kind of emotional frost clinging to him like a second coat. The ceremony began with the solemn cadence typical of Anglican rites. The priest's voice rose and fell in measured tones, echoing faintly against stone and wood. Eleanor answered each question with clarity, her voice unwavering even as her pulse quickened. The Duke responded with equal composure, though a peculiar flatness underlined his words, as if each syllable were a stone placed carefully in a row. When the vows concluded, the atmosphere shifted, dense with anticipation. The priest stepped back, permitting the couple their first kiss as husband and wife. The Duke leaned toward her, and for an instant she saw the faint tremor in his breath, the subtle tightening of his jaw. His lips touched hers with the gentle precision of a man fulfilling a duty rather than embracing a future. But it was what followed that struck her with a quiet force. His mouth brushed her ear, and in a whisper barely carried above the rustling gowns behind them, he murmured, "My heart died with the mother of my children." The words were not cruel. If anything, they were spoken with such stark honesty that they cut deeper precisely because they were free of malice. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though her face remained a mask of serene composure. Around them, the congregation erupted into polite applause, unaware of the blow she had just absorbed. The Duke stepped back, his expression unchanged, his gaze drifting toward the stained-glass window that cast muted colors across the altar. Eleanor's own gaze shifted downward for a breath, allowing herself the smallest falter before she reclaimed her posture. She felt suddenly like a placeholder, a necessary figure intended to restore stability to a household whose emotional center had long since crumbled. As they exited the church, the London fog curled around them like a living thing, softening the edges of buildings and carriages, turning gas lamps into blurred halos. The streets echoed with distant wheels and hooves, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of the fragility of her new position. The Duke offered his arm. She accepted it with the practiced grace expected of her, though his touch held no warmth. He did not look at her as they descended the steps, but neither did he withdraw. Duty bound them, even if affection did not. Their carriage awaited, black lacquer gleaming faintly beneath the pale sky. As they stepped inside, the Duke remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window as if the city beyond offered him some refuge from the intimacy of sharing enclosed space. Eleanor studied him for a moment, noting the subtle signs of tension, how his fingers tapped once against his knee before he stilled them, how his throat tightened when the carriage jolted forward. She sensed he did not wish to hurt her. He simply did not have the capacity to offer what had long ago been buried. She turned her attention outward, watching London roll past in muted tones, the somber facades of Mayfair homes, the clipped silhouettes of pedestrians, the faint drift of chimney smoke. She wondered what sort of life awaited her at Rudom Hall, wondered whether the servants' loyalty to the late Duchess would leave her perpetually in the shadows. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a quiet, determined ember flickered. She had survived expectations, propriety, and the unyielding pressure of social scrutiny. She would survive this too. The carriage slowed as they approached the route leading toward their reception, its path lined with curious onlookers hoping for a glimpse of aristocratic spectacle. Eleanor straightened, allowing a serene composure to settle over her once more. She had stepped into a life shaped by grief not her own, yet she would not allow sorrow to dictate her every breath. Not today. Not ever. The Duke glanced at her then, a fleeting look, brief as a sigh, and though it revealed nothing, it carried the faintest suggestion that beneath his iron resolve, something remained unspoken. She met his gaze without flinching, offering no accusation, only acknowledgment. Whatever their future held, it would begin here, in this moment suspended between duty and possibility. And as the carriage rolled forward, she felt the hinge of her life shift, opening into an unknown she was determined to face with unbroken grace. Rudom Hall emerged from the winter mist like a relic carved from an age older than memory, its gray stone facade veined with ivy and softened by decades of quiet neglect. Eleanor watched it draw nearer through the carriage window, her breath fogging the glass as she took in the imposing silhouette. The hall did not resemble the home of a man ready to welcome a new duchess. Rather, it stood like a mausoleum devoted to a life no longer lived. When the carriage halted, the Duke stepped out first, his movements precise and devoid of hesitation. He extended his hand to her, and though she accepted it, she sensed his touch was a gesture of obligation rather than partnership. The air held the crisp bite of late autumn, yet the sight of the estate's shuttered windows chilled her more deeply than the wind ever could. Servants assembled in a modest line at the entrance, their expressions composed with professional courtesy. Yet beneath their careful manners, Eleanor detected something unspoken. Those fleeting glances exchanged between footmen, the guarded stiffness of the butler, the way the housekeeper's eyes briefly flicked toward the Duke before settling on Eleanor with a polite but distant inclination. Loyalty here, she realized, had long ago been pledged to another woman, one whose presence lingered like a velvet shadow stretching across every threshold. Eleanor greeted them with gentle warmth, her voice steady, though she sensed their appraisal measuring her against an impossible ideal. Inside, the hall's great foyer loomed with an austere grandeur. The portraits that lined the walls, though dimmed by dust and time, seemed to watch their new mistress with softened suspicion. The late Duchess appeared often, seated in gardens, framed by silk drapery, always depicted with a serene, almost fragile grace. Eleanor paused before one such portrait, studying the delicate curve of the woman's smile, the pale radiance of her skin. She understood, with a tightening in her chest, that she was entering a life curated by another's memory, one preserved so carefully that any intrusion might feel like sacrilege. The Duke cleared his throat softly behind her. "The children are in the nursery," he said, his tone even but not unkind. It was the first voluntary sentence he had spoken since the wedding. "They keep to their routines. I trust you will find them manageable." The hesitation in his final word revealed more than he intended. Eleanor turned to him, noting the flicker of vulnerability that crossed his gaze before he concealed it behind composure. She offered a small nod, aware that this moment represented a tentative bridge between them, fragile and narrow, but not non-existent. He led her through the corridors toward the family quarters, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The hallways bore signs of a home once filled with affection. Embroidered cushions placed with care, vases awaiting fresh blossoms, shelves stocked with children's books. Yet each object seemed paused, as if the house itself had been holding its breath since the Duchess's death. When they reached the nursery, the Duke stopped before the door. "I will leave you to it," he murmured, touching the brass handle but not turning it. "The children may require patience." Without awaiting her reply, he stepped back, retreating with the quiet dignity of a man painfully aware of his inadequacies. Eleanor drew a steadying breath before entering. Inside, she found young Arthur seated at a small desk, his posture immaculate, his attention fixed on a book he did not appear to be reading. His dark hair, neatly combed, framed a face too solemn for a boy of 8. Clara, only 5, perched near the window with a doll held tightly against her chest. The moment they noticed Eleanor, Arthur closed his book with careful deliberation, while Clara's small fingers clutched the doll so fiercely that the fabric creased beneath her grip. Eleanor offered them a warm, gentle smile. "Good afternoon, Arthur." "Good afternoon, Clara. I am very pleased to meet you both." Her voice, soft yet confident, carried no expectation, only sincerity. Arthur studied her with a seriousness that might have unnerved someone less prepared. "Papa said you would come," he replied, his tone polite but distant. Clara remained silent, her wide eyes bright with wary curiosity. Eleanor lowered herself to the children's height, refusing to loom over them like an intruder. "I hope we shall grow to know each other well," she said, though she understood they might not believe her yet. Arthur's gaze drifted to a small portrait on the mantel, an image of his mother, her painted eyes serene and eternal. "Mama always read to us before tea," he murmured, as if the statement explained everything. Eleanor followed his gaze, feeling the late Duchess's presence once more encircle the room. She chose her next words with care. "Then perhaps you might choose a book for us to read together later," she suggested, offering respect rather than replacement. Arthur blinked, surprised not by the request but by the gentleness with which it was made. He nodded once, a movement small enough to be missed, yet meaningful. Clara rose from her seat, her doll clasped in one hand. She approached Eleanor cautiously, inch by inch, like a sparrow testing whether a stranger's hand might hold seed or snare. Eleanor remained perfectly still, allowing the child to decide the distance. Clara finally stopped before her and raised the doll. "Her name is Lily," she whispered. It was the first softness Eleanor had heard from her. Eleanor reached out, but did not touch the doll. She merely admired it from a respectful distance. "Lily is lovely," she murmured. "Thank you for introducing her." Clara's shoulders loosened, her gaze flickering toward the ground with shy relief. As the afternoon unfolded, Eleanor observed their habits with quiet diligence. Arthur's stoicism masked a longing for direction, while Clara's timidity concealed a fragile hope for reassurance. These children, shaped by absence and silence, needed gentleness woven with consistency. Eleanor, though not a mother herself, possessed a compassionate sensibility honed through years of managing younger cousins and charitable duties. She recognized the signs of hearts cautious but not closed. When she finally stepped back into the corridor, the Duke stood at a distance, half hidden by the play of candlelight across the walls. He had not intended to be caught watching, yet his expression held a muted astonishment. "They did not cry," he said softly, almost incredulous. Eleanor folded her hands calmly before her. "Children rarely fear kindness," she replied. It was not a rebuke, merely truth offered with quiet dignity. A faint, weary breath escaped him, neither sigh nor surrender, but something in between. For the first time, she glimpsed the vulnerable man beneath the title, an individual shaped not only by loss but by the immense pressure to remain unbroken for everyone but himself. Their gazes met, and though no warmth sparked, neither was there coldness. Instead, an unspoken acknowledgment passed between them, a recognition of shared responsibility, tentative and delicate. The corridor's lanterns flickered softly as if the house itself were adjusting to her presence. Eleanor sensed that Rudom Hall, long steeped in sorrow, might yet hold room for change. The path would not be smooth, nor would affection blossom easily in soil hardened by grief. But the children had accepted her presence, if only by degrees, and that alone marked the beginning of something worth nurturing. As the Duke stepped aside to let her pass, his voice, low and unfamiliar with vulnerability, brushed the air. "Thank you," he murmured, the words barely audible yet unmistakably sincere. Eleanor inclined her head, her heartbeat steady with renewed resolve. The shadows of Rudom Hall still clung to every corridor, but as she walked forward, she sensed they were no longer quite as impenetrable as when she had first arrived. Life at Rudom Hall settled into a rhythm that was neither harmonious nor discordant, but something in between, a cautious negotiation between past and present. Eleanor rose early each morning, long before the household stirred, using the quiet to acquaint herself with the estate's intricate demands. She studied tenant records, crop yields, and correspondence left unattended during the Duke's year of mourning, piecing together the workings of a realm she had been expected merely to adorn. The Duke seldom joined her for breakfast, choosing instead to take his meals in his study or during solitary rides across the mist-laden fields. Yet their paths crossed often enough to create a subtle, uneasy pattern, a glance exchanged in the corridor, a brief discussion over an urgent letter, a moment of shared silence when neither could summon the words that would bridge the distance between them. Though reserved, the Duke seemed gradually aware of Eleanor's unwavering diligence. One morning, as she addressed a matter concerning a tenant family displaced by a collapsed roof, he paused in the doorway of the small sitting room she had quietly adopted as her working space. "You need not entangle yourself in every domestic concern," he remarked, his tone more contemplative than admonishing. Eleanor looked up from the papers, her expression calm. "I cannot preside over a household I do not understand," she replied. "If these people depend on Rudom, I must know how to serve them." The Duke considered her words with an unreadable gaze, then offered a slight nod before retreating, leaving her with a faint sense that something in him had shifted, barely perceptible but real. As weeks turned into months, the estate staff began to regard Eleanor with a cautious respect. She never raised her voice, never imposed authority for spectacle's sake, and never presumed familiarity. Instead, she asked questions, gentle, thoughtful inquiries that invited trust without demanding it. Mrs. Harbury, the housekeeper who had served the late Duchess with almost religious devotion, found herself reluctantly admiring the new mistress's constancy. "Her Grace listens," she confided one evening to a maid. "Not merely hears, listens. It is unsettling, but not unwelcome." Such acknowledgments, exchanged privately among those who kept the hall running, marked the first softening of long-held loyalties. Eleanor's relationship with the children grew steadily, shaped by patience and small but meaningful gestures. Arthur, though still solemn, began seeking her opinion on his geography lessons, presenting his maps for her to inspect with a faint flush of pride. Clara, who once shrank from any unfamiliar touch, now slipped her hand into Eleanor's during evening walks in the garden. These moments, delicate, unspoken, warmed Eleanor in ways she did not confess aloud, not even to her own heart. She sensed the Duke noticed the children's growing ease, though he said nothing. His observations remained quiet, tucked into the corners of shared spaces where he lingered just long enough to witness without intruding. It was during a late winter meeting of the Estate Council that Eleanor's influence first collided with the Duke's guarded manner. The council gathered in the library, where the scent of dust and aging parchment mingled with the faint aroma of the fire. Eleanor sat beside the Duke, her posture attentive yet composed. They discussed taxation, crop failures, and the declining conditions of several cottages. When she suggested allocating funds for winter coal deliveries to the poorest tenants, a murmur rippled through the assembled men. The Duke's steward hesitated before voicing a concern about the expense. Eleanor responded before the Duke could intervene. "Cold steals more than comfort," she said, her voice even but resolute. "It steals health, dignity, and the trust tenants must place in their landlord. A small provision now prevents greater hardship later." Her words hung in the air, surprising even herself with their quiet force. The Duke turned toward her, his gaze narrowing not in disapproval but in contemplation. After a long moment, he addressed the council. "Her Grace speaks with reason," he declared. "See that the coal is delivered." The shock among the council members was palpable, though quickly masked by dutiful bows. Eleanor felt the Duke's acknowledgment like a warmth spreading through a room long kept cold. Yet she sensed, too, the tension within him, the discomfort of allowing another voice to influence a realm he had long governed alone. As spring approached, Subtle changes marked the estate's atmosphere. Curtains were drawn open earlier. Fires burned a touch brighter. Fresh flowers, though modest in number, began appearing in rooms that had once been tomb-like in their austerity. Eleanor did not know whether these shifts occurred because of her or merely alongside her, but she cherished each one for the fragile hope it represented. Yet the shadow of the late Duchess remained unrelenting. Eleanor encountered it most acutely in the West Wing, where the previous mistress's rooms had been preserved untouched. The door was always closed, yet the servants treated that space as if the Duchess still occupied it. Eleanor respected the barrier, never crossing it, though something in her longed to understand the woman whose absence had shaped every corridor. The Duke visited the wing occasionally, always at twilight, always returning with the same rigid composure. Eleanor felt his grief then, not the sharp grief of fresh loss, but the kind that calcifies over time, turning soft sorrow into stone. One evening, when the children slept and the house settled into its nocturnal hush, Eleanor wandered into the drawing-room to review correspondence. She found the Duke already there, seated near the fire with a decanter of brandy untouched beside him. The flames cast warm shadows across his face, softening the sharp lines of fatigue etched into his features. He glanced up, startled by her presence, but did not rise. "You work tirelessly," he said quietly, breaking the silence before it grew heavy. Eleanor set her letters aside. "There is much to tend," she replied. "A household cannot thrive on habit alone." The Duke leaned back, his gaze unfocused as though wrestling with something unvoiced. "You have done more in months than I managed in a year," he admitted. "I did not expect—" His words trailed off, the unfinished sentence lingering between them. Eleanor waited, giving him the space he seemed not to know how to claim. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, nearly vulnerable. "They laugh more," he murmured. "The children. I hear it from the corridor." The confession struck Eleanor with a tenderness she had not prepared for. She responded with care, unwilling to disturb his fragile openness. "They seek steadiness," she said gently. "I merely offer it." The Duke's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in a complex struggle of gratitude and guilt. "I failed them," he whispered. "I failed all of you." Eleanor shook her head, her voice steady despite the ache rising within her. "You grieved," she said. "That is not failure." Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, the silence between them was not empty but full, of loss, hope, and the faintest flicker of something unnamed. The Duke looked away first, the spell broken, yet not erased. Eleanor rose, sensing the moment had reached its fragile limit. As she moved toward the door, she felt his gaze follow her. "Good night, Your Grace," she murmured. His reply was delayed, weighted with thought. "Good night, Eleanor." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Winter arrived with a severity that even the oldest tenants claimed felt unusual, sweeping across Rudom Hall with winds that rattled window panes and pressed icy fingers beneath every door. Eleanor woke each morning to a world bleached of color, the estate grounds buried beneath a pale, unbroken crust that muted every sound. There was beauty in it, a stark, crystalline beauty, but there was danger as well. Illness traveled swiftly in such weather, particularly among the poorest families living in the far cottages whose roofs barely held off the drafts. Eleanor spent hours each day reviewing lists from the steward, ensuring coal deliveries continued, even as roads became treacherous and the horses fatigued from their endless, freezing labor. The Duke supported these efforts silently, signing letters and dispatch orders without debate, yet Eleanor sensed tension gathering in him like the low hum before a storm. It was Clara who first fell ill. The child's cough, faint at first, deepened into a rasp that rattled her small frame. Eleanor ordered warm compresses, broth, and constant airflow in the nursery, but by the second night, Clara's pale cheeks burned with fever. Arthur, usually stoic, hovered near his sister's bedside, his attempts at courage betrayed by trembling fingers. The governess fretted ineffectively, unable to disguise her fear. Eleanor dismissed her gently, choosing instead to sit with the children herself, her calm presence a quiet anchor amid the uncertainty. When the Duke entered the nursery late that evening, the sight of him startled Eleanor. He looked as if he had been carved from the same bleak night that raged outside. His expression taut, his hair disheveled, his usual composure fragmented at the edges. He paused in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Clara's flushed face. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice low but strained. Eleanor rose slowly, unwilling to leave Clara's side yet understanding his need for knowledge. "Her fever worsened at dusk," she replied. "The physician has been summoned. Until he arrives, we can only keep her cool and hope the worst passes." The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked younger, a man stripped of titles and defenses, laid bare by fear. He approached the small bed and knelt beside it, brushing Clara's damp curls from her forehead with shaking fingers. Eleanor had never seen him so vulnerable, and the sight pierced her more deeply than any words could. She lowered herself beside him, careful to give him space yet refusing to retreat entirely. "She is strong," Eleanor murmured. "Children endure more than we imagine." The Duke swallowed hard, as though the reassurance reached a place he had long kept locked. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. The hall, usually alive with the movements of servants, seemed frozen in suspended breath. Eleanor remained alert, wiping Clara's brow, coaxing Arthur to rest, and speaking in quiet tones that soothed without promising false certainty. The Duke hovered at first, restless and silent, before taking a seat opposite Eleanor. They worked side by side, tending to their daughter. The word settled softly in Eleanor's mind, though she dared not speak it aloud. When the physician finally arrived, he examined Clara with swift, practiced movements. His verdict was cautious but hopeful: a severe winter fever, dangerous but not dire if carefully monitored. The Duke exhaled sharply, the sound closer to a sob than a sigh. Once the physician left instructions and departed, Eleanor resumed her post. The Duke, however, did not rise. Instead, he remained seated, staring at Clara with an expression that carried years of guilt. "Her mother died after a fever," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was helpless then, too." Eleanor listened, her heart tightening. She had long suspected the depth of his wound but had never heard it spoken. She shifted slightly, angling toward him. "You were not helpless," she said softly. "You grieved. That is not the same." The Duke's gaze snapped toward her, pained. "I blurred the distinction," he murmured. "I turned grief into penance, and penance into habit. I let it swallow everything. My children, my home, even myself." His admission seemed to cost him something immense. Eleanor did not reach for him, though the impulse flickered through her. Instead, she allowed silence to settle between them, not as a barrier but as a space in which honesty could breathe. "They need you," she eventually said. "Not as a monument to the past, but as their father." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something weary yet resolute glimmered within. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What do you need of me?" The question unsettled her, not because she lacked an answer, but because she feared the truth of it. She inhaled slowly. "Only that you see me," she replied. "Not as a replacement, nor as an obligation. Simply as I am." Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. The Duke took in her words with a stillness that felt searching, almost reverent. Clara stirred then, her fever breaking just enough for her small voice to emerge in a faint whisper. "Mama?" The single word sliced through the room like a blade dipped in longing. Arthur woke at once, reaching for Eleanor as if by instinct. But it was the Duke who reacted most profoundly, flinching as though struck. Eleanor soothed Clara gently. "I am here," she murmured, not claiming a title she had not earned, but offering comfort freely. The child relaxed, her breathing easing. Arthur leaned against Eleanor's arm, his trust a quiet blessing. The Duke watched the scene with a gaze that shifted by degree, confusion softening into recognition, then into something approaching awe. "She turns to you," he whispered. "They both do." Eleanor met his eyes, her own steady but shining. "Children can sense when someone will not leave," she replied. "They have a gift for discerning constancy." The Duke absorbed this, his expression breaking into a grief-laced tenderness she had never witnessed in him. As dawn approached, Clara's fever receded further, and exhaustion settled heavily upon both adults. The Duke rose unsteadily, rubbing a hand across his face. "You should rest," he said, though the concern in his voice was raw enough to betray its deeper meaning. Eleanor shook her head. "Not until she sleeps." The Duke paused, then sank back into his chair with a quiet surrender. "Then I will remain as well," he murmured. They shared a fragile, tentative smile, one that acknowledged both the night's terror and the strange, delicate bond forged within it. When Clara finally drifted into a peaceful slumber, the room exhaled its tension. The Duke leaned forward, his voice a whisper carried on weary breath. "Eleanor," he said, speaking her name with a reverence that held neither hesitation nor distance. "You have given this house something I thought forever lost." She looked at him, her heart steady yet aching. "Not given," she corrected gently. "Offered. Whether it becomes part of this home depends on what we build." The Duke's expression shifted, a quiet resolve stirring beneath the remnants of fear and regret. "Then let us build," he murmured. The words trembled slightly, as though unused to hope. Eleanor felt warmth unfurl through her chest, steady and slow, like the first thaw of spring beneath deep snow. Outside, the sky brightened with the faintest blush of morning. Inside, the Duke reached for her hand, not as a man fulfilling duty, but as one choosing, deliberately, to step out of the shadows.